In the dark of night, 3 small hands trembled with hunger when she opened the forbidden door. The silence weighed more than the risk, but what was born there could not be denied. Until a gaze from the desert changed everything. Subscribe to the channel and follow this pact that defies the impossible. On the forgotten edge of a red dirt road, where the Cerrado wind raised dust and promises never kept, Iracema walked with a scarf over her face. She was 48 years old, with the thin body of someone who had known work since early on, skin marked by the sun, and calloused hands that had buried more dreams than they could count. The sky of Mato Grosso stretched immensely above her, indifferent to her pain, while her steps left timid marks on the dry ground of the abandoned farm she now called home. She had become a widow 6 months ago. 2 decades earlier, she had married Augusto, son of Colonel Machado, one of the region's biggest landowners. A marriage between a rich white man and a poor black woman was considered an affront in those remote parts of deep Brazil, and they never forgave her for it. When Augusto fell ill with a fever that consumed his body in a few weeks and departed without leaving a will, his family expelled her from the big house with only a bundle of clothes and the bitter memory that people like her had no place among decent folk. Since then, she had been living in the back of a long-abandoned farm, among cracked mud walls and the silence that only the rejected know. She planted cassava, corn and beans in a small plot, harvested what the parched soil allowed, and slept with a sickle beside her mat. No one visited her. No one cared. Until the dawn that changed everything. The sun had barely risen over the Cerrado when Iracema spotted what she thought were shadows near the old farm's watermill. She approached cautiously, her hand firm on the sickle. When her eyes adjusted to the gloom of the shed, she felt her heart race. 3 small bodies huddled together, motionless, with sunken eyes hidden under the dry trough of the old watermill. They were covered in red dust, their black hair tangled, clothes in tatters. They didn't speak. They only looked at her with eyes that seemed too old for such young faces. Triplets, 2 girls and a boy, copper-colored skin, hair as dark as a moonless night. The smallest was trembling, high fever consuming her fragile little body. Their silence told stories that words couldn't express. The absence of crying or pleading told Iracema they had been alone for days. She didn't need to ask where they came from. The seed bracelets on their thin wrists, the faded geometric designs on their skin, everything revealed their origin. They were Guat-Oth3 children, people of the Pantanal waters. Iracema knew what she should do. Notify the authorities. Hand the children over to the Guardianship Council. It was the correct procedure, the legal one. But in the deep Brazil where she lived, she also knew what would happen. The siblings would be separated, sent to different institutions or to families who would try to erase their origin. Integration, they called it. She knew another name for it. She looked once more at the 3 pairs of eyes that watched her without blinking, without pleading, just waiting for what fate had in store for them through this unknown woman. At that moment, something inside Iracema, perhaps the same rebelliousness that had made her love a forbidden man, made a decision that would change everything. She took the smallest girl in her arms, feeling the heat of the fever through the torn nightgown, and gestured for the others to follow her. "Come," she said simply. And they followed her in silence to the mud and straw hut. That night, the 3 slept on improvised mats in the small kitchen. They didn't speak Portuguese, or perhaps fear had stolen their voices. They ate eagerly the cassava broth Iracema prepared, drank fresh water from the well, and fell asleep clinging to each other, like cubs afraid of being separated. Iracema watched over their sleep, cooling the feverish girl's forehead with damp cloths, thinking about what she had done. Taking in indigenous children without documents or authorization was considered a serious crime, cultural appropriation or kidnapping, depending on who was judging. But she wasn't thinking about the law as she watched the difficult breathing of the little one, the scratches on the other girl's legs, the boy's hands that still trembled when holding the water cup. In the following weeks, a silent routine was established. Iracema washed their clothes in water with lemon balm to ward off evil spirits, as her grandmother had taught her. She showed them how to brush their teeth with jute bark, how to squat to relieve themselves away from the house, how to distinguish the song of the great kiskadee from the thrush. Since they didn't speak, and she needed to call them something, She gave them temporary names: Jurema for the girl who had arrived with a fever, Janana for the tallest and most restless, Rauni for the boy with the vigilant gaze. She knew they had other names from their people, but she respected their silence. She didn't force them. She taught them to sow corn, to recognize when beans were ready to harvest, to hide when they spotted horse dust or car engines on the road. As the days passed, their thin bodies gained strength. Their eyes lost some of the fear, and sometimes, just sometimes, Irasima would catch an almost smile on Janawana's face when she saw the yellow ipe trees blooming in the field. It was on a hot September afternoon, when the sky threatened rain and the birds flew low announcing a storm, that Irasima heard for the first time. She was in the backyard collecting clothes from the line when a soft sound reached her ears, a melody, low and hesitant. She approached the window quietly and saw Jurema was singing. Words in a language she didn't understand, small hands marking rhythm on the packed earth floor. Janana accompanied with subtle claps. Rauni drew symbols on the ground with a twig. It was a game, an old playtime ritual. But it was more than that. It was living memory. They were preserving what they knew, teaching each other, keeping the flame of knowledge that someone had tried to extinguish. Silent tears ran down Irasima's face. These were not just lost children. They were guardians of a history that Brazil wanted to forget. 3 months had passed since the children arrived. The rainy season was beginning to show signs, with heavy clouds forming on the Pantanal horizon. Irasima had learned to distinguish the meaning of the drawings Rauni made in the earth. Stars, fish, birds, symbols of a people who read nature as others read books. When Jurema caught a high fever, it was Jana Unna who showed Irasima which root should be collected by the small stream, how to prepare it as an infusion, how many drops of wild honey to add. The ancestral knowledge flowed from those children like spring water, pure and vital. Gradually words began to emerge. First in Guata 3, then timid attempts in Portuguese. "Water," said Rauni one morning, pointing to the clay pot. "Fire," whispered Jurema, looking at the wood stove. And when Janana, the most distrustful of the three, finally called Irasima by name, something broke inside the woman, a wall of fear, years of solitude. The children began to call her Mother Irasima, 2 words joined as if they were one, a new concept they created to define that nameless relationship. The small house came to life. Irasima hung colored gourds from the eaves, planted flowers in old milk buckets, and the children built fish traps using techniques no book would teach. At night, sitting around the fire in the yard, Rauni pointed to the stars and said their names in the Guatathoi 3 language, while Irasima taught the songs from her childhood in Salvador, before migrating to the Midwest. It was a silent exchange, a mutual understanding between people the world had discarded. But the peace lasted less than the blooming of the IPA trees. One October afternoon, when the heat made the earth crack, Irasima spotted a cloud of dust on the road. She quickly made the agreed signal, and the children hid in the hideout they had prepared. An improvised cellar under the pantry floor, covered with mats and sacks of provisions. Mr. Teodoro, the only neighbor within a 5-kilometer radius, arrived on horseback. A man of few words and much suspicion, he stopped a few meters from the house without dismounting. "Donna Irasima, you've had company, haven't you?" The question fell like a stone in the well of anxiety Irasima carried. She kept her face impassive, years of survival teaching her to hide emotions. "Company? Only loneliness, Mr. Teodoro." He chewed a piece of tobacco, his eyes scanning the yard where 3 pairs of tire sandals dried in the sun. "Strange. I've been hearing children's voices. And you were never one to talk to yourself." Irasima felt cold sweat run down her spine. "Must be the radio. I bought a battery-powered one at the Pocono market," she lied, knowing he wouldn't believe it, but needing to buy time. Radio." Mr. Teodoro spat on the ground. "Well, you should know people are looking for 3 little Indians. They say they disappeared after illegal mining invaded their village near the river. The Funai folks are offering a reward." Irasima's stomach contracted. Reward, the word that transformed children into merchandise. "How sad," she said, keeping her voice firm. "I hope they find them." Mr. Teodoro adjusted his hat, preparing to leave. "If you hear anything." He left the phrase hanging in the air, a veiled threat hovering like the hawk circling above their heads. The government's keeping an eye on these things now. Improper appropriation, they call it. Can get you jail time, you know? And he left, leaving behind silence and fear. That night, Irasema couldn't sleep, sitting at the door of the hut. She looked at the full moon and thought about the choices life imposed on her. Should she surrender the children? Would it be right, legal? Or should she continue hiding them, protecting them from the world that had already taken so much from them? It was Raoni who answered her silent doubts. In the middle of the night, the boy sat down beside her and for the first time spoke a complete sentence in Portuguese. Our village doesn't exist anymore. His dark eyes fixed on hers, his voice low but firm. White men came with yellow machines. My mother told us to run to the river, that she would come for us later. We waited 3 days. She didn't come. Irasema felt her heart tighten. She needed no further explanation. She knew well the story that had been repeating itself for centuries in Brazil. Lands invaded, families separated, lives treated as obstacles to progress. She hugged the boy, feeling his fragile bones beneath his skin, his warm breath against her chest. You're safe here, she promised. I'll protect you. But as the words left her mouth, she knew it was a difficult promise to keep. She had 30 days at most, before Mr. Teodoro's visit turned into a formal complaint. 30 days to decide the fate of those children and her own. In the days that followed, Irasema began teaching Portuguese more intensively to the little ones. If they needed to flee, if they needed to defend themselves, they would need the oppressor's language. She showed them old document photos, explained what certificates and records were, the bureaucracy that determined who officially existed and who did not. The children learned quickly, especially Jana Oana, who soon began forming complex sentences, asking about the world beyond the farm, questioning why they needed to hide. Because not everyone understands that family isn't just blood, Irasema explained one afternoon as they shelled corn together. Some people think you need to be with your own even if your own... She hesitated, avoiding the word the children feared, even if they can't care for you anymore. Janana was silent for a moment, her small hands working skillfully with the corn cobs. You are ours now, she said simply. And we are yours. The simplicity of the statement broke something inside Irasema. That night, while the children slept, she made a decision. She wouldn't surrender them. She wouldn't return them to a system that would separate them, that would erase their culture, that would transform them into statistics. She needed a plan. And she needed help. The next morning, she tied a scarf on her head, put on her only good dress, and walked 3 hours to the nearest village. Curumbiara was little more than a dirt road, a few brick houses, a store that served as market, bar, and telephone post. She went straight to the small adobe church at the end of the street, where she knew she would find the only person who might help, Sister Consivo. The nun was already past 70, but had lively eyes and a reputation for defying authorities when necessary. It was said that during the dictatorship, she had hidden regime opponents in her convent. If anyone would understand, it would be her. Irasema waited until the nun finished her morning prayers and approached, hands trembling with nervousness. Sister, I need advice. And help. The religious woman looked at her over her thick-rimmed glasses, evaluating the woman before her. It's about the Guatau 3 children, isn't it? The ones you're hiding. Irasema felt her blood freeze in her veins. How? The Lord tells me many things during my prayers, said the nun with a half-smile. And gossip runs faster than floodwater in this forsaken place. She lowered her voice, coming closer. You did well to come to me, but you have exactly 3 weeks before the Funai men come with the police. They're already organizing the search. 3 weeks. Less time than Irasema had imagined. She felt despair growing inside her, but the nun's voice brought her back. There is a way. It's not easy nor entirely legal, but it's just... At that moment, as the church bell rang announcing noon, a plan began to form. A risky plan that would depend on forged documents, on friends in strategic places, on necessary lies, and on the imminent arrival of someone neither woman expected, but who would change everything, the children's father. The rain fell in dense curtains over the Curado, transforming the red earth into slippery mud. Irasema was returning from Curumbiara, with a package protected inside her blouse. Documents Sister Consifono had obtained through old contacts. Blank birth certificates, a temporary guardianship form, papers that could give the children an official existence even if based on half-truths. There were 2 weeks left before the deadline the nun had mentioned. 2 weeks to transform 3 missing indigenous children into the legitimate nieces and nephew of a lonely widow. As she walked along the muddy road, a shiver ran up her spine, instinct, presence, someone was watching. She stopped, pretending to adjust her sandal, while her eyes scanned the dense vegetation that bordered the path. That's when she saw it, a darker shadow among the trees, motionless like a jaguar before pouncing. It wasn't an animal. It was a man. Tall, broad-shouldered, black hair cut close to the head. He wore worn jeans and a faded flannel shirt. White man's clothes, but his bearing, his posture, his way of blending into the landscape revealed his true origin. Irasima felt her heart accelerate. She needed no explanations to know who he was. They remained like this, motionless, studying each other in silence under the rain that gave no respite. He was the first to move, coming out from the protection of the trees onto the road. There was no threat in his movements, only determination. He stopped 3 steps from Irasima. "My children," he said in clear Portuguese, though with a marked accent. "Where are my children?" The truth was revealed in layers. His name was Ubirajara, one of the few Guatua 3 men with formal education, a teacher in the village before the miners' invasion. When the attack happened, he was in Campo Grande participating in a conference on indigenous rights. Upon returning, he found destruction, burned houses, devastated plantations, and his wife's body among dozens of others. "I've been searching for my children everywhere," he said, as they walked side by side in the fine rain. Someone spoke of a black woman who lived alone near the old São João mill, who had new children at home. There was no accusation in his voice, just the exhaustion of someone who had traveled hundreds of kilometers, driven by a last hope. Irasima could lie. She could deny. She could send him away and cling to the plan she had begun to trace with Sister Consciemosifahano. But something in those eyes, the same pain she saw in the mirror every morning, prevented her. "They're safe," she answered simply. "They're with me." When they reached the small house, the children were playing inside, sheltered from the rain. Irasima entered first, her heart heavy with what she was about to lose. "I have a surprise for you," she announced, her voice almost breaking. The 3 heads rose in unison, curious. That's when she stepped away from the door and Ubirajara entered. Time seemed to freeze. No one moved for several seconds. Then, as if an invisible dam had broken, Jurema ran first, then Janoana, finally Reoni, always the most cautious. They ran and surrounded their father, clinging to his legs, his waist, crying and talking at the same time, in the language Irasima didn't understand. Ubirajara knelt, embracing all 3 at once, his normally stoic face now bathed in silent tears. Irasima observed from the door, an intruder in that reunion. She felt a sharp pain in her chest, the pain of losing once again something she loved. But there was also an unexpected relief. The children had their father back. They weren't orphans. They wouldn't need false documents or invented stories. They could simply be who they were. She turned to leave, to give them privacy, when Ubirajara's voice stopped her. "Stay." One word. A request. An acknowledgement. When night fell, a strange silence hung over the house. Ubirajara sat on the kitchen floor, the children asleep around him after hours of stories and explanations. He looked at Irasima, who was preparing a lemon balm tea on the wood stove. "You saved my children," he said finally. It wasn't a question, but a statement. "Anyone would have done the same," she replied, avoiding his gaze. "No, anyone would have turned them over to the authorities, or worse, ignored 3 starving indigenous children." There was another long silence, filled only by the crackling of the fire and the drumming of the rain on the straw roof. "I have a proposal," he said finally. And then, in simple but direct words, he explained he couldn't take the children back to the village. There was no village anymore. He couldn't take them to the city. They would be discriminated against, mistreated. He had nowhere to go, except a distant reservation where distant cousins lived in precarious conditions. "The children need stability, security, a home." His eyes met Irasima's. They found that here. The proposal was simple and, at the same time, revolutionary. They would stay, all of them. Ubirajara would help with the crops, with hunting, with repairs to the house. He would teach the children the language and traditions of his people. And Irasima would continue to be Mother Irasima, the woman who saved them when no one else cared. That night, Irasima didn't answer. She needed to think. The idea of sharing her small space, her solitary life, with a man she barely knew and 3 lively children was frightening. But the alternative, the empty house again, the oppressive, silence of nights without the children's laughter, was equally terrifying. The next morning, when Ubirajara woke up, Irasima was already in the yard, feeding the chickens. Without a word, she handed him a hoe. He took it, understanding the gesture for what it was: acceptance. A silent pact was established in the days that followed. Ubirajara slept in the tool shed, which he cleaned and organized. He rose before dawn to fish in the stream, returning with fresh fish for breakfast. He fixed the leaking roof, reinforced the mud walls, built a fenced garden to protect against wild animals. Irasima continued to take care of the kitchen, the clothes, the small wounds and illnesses that afflicted the children. At night he told old stories of the Guata 3 people, spoke of the ancestors, of the spirits of the forest and river. She taught Bahian lullabies, African proverbs her grandmother repeated, recipes that mixed influences from distant worlds. The children flourished in this unique environment. They spoke Portuguese with Irasima, Guatemala 3 with their father, and sometimes created hybrid words only they understood. Raoni showed talent for carving small animals in wood. Jana Ana revealed herself as a skilled weaver, quickly learning the techniques Irasima taught her. Jurema, always the quietest, surprised everyone with her gift for plants. She knew intuitively which to gather for each type of tea or medicine. But peace had an expiration date. There was 1 week left before the arrival of the Funai men and the police, according to Sister Consejanto's information. 1 week to resolve a situation that Brazilian laws didn't anticipate. An improvised family, built on the margins of society, united not by blood or by papers, but by necessity and affection. It was Ubirajara who suggested the solution. One night while the children slept, "We need documents. Legitimate ones." Irasima looked at him with surprise. "How? Funai knows the children are missing." "They're searching." He nodded, his face illuminated only by the weak light of the lamp. "That's why we need to reach them first. With our story. The true one." The plan was audacious. They would go together to Campo Grande, to the Funai headquarters. Ubirajara, as a recognized indigenous teacher, had some credibility. They would explain the situation, the surviving children, the father who searched for them, the woman who saved them. They would ask for regularization of the situation, perhaps a shared custody, perhaps a special arrangement that would allow the children to maintain their indigenous identity while living under the care of both. "They will never accept," said Irasima, her voice laden with skepticism. "The system wasn't made for people like us." Ubirajara took her rough hands in his. An unexpected gesture, the first physical contact between them. "Then we change the system." 3 days later, an old pickup borrowed from Sister Consejanto parked in front of the house. The children were settled in the back, protected by an improvised tarpaulin. Irasima locked the door, a symbolic gesture since there was nothing of value to steal, and climbed into the passenger seat. Ubirajara drove, focused on the muddy road that would take them first to Corumbiara, then to the highway and finally to Campo Grande. The journey would take 2 days. 2 days of bad roads, of overnight stays at gas stations, of suspicious looks at the indigenous man, the black woman, and the 3 children who resembled neither. 2 days to rehearse what they would say, to prepare the children, to strengthen the resolution they had taken. When the sun began to set on the Cerrado horizon, Irasima looked at Ubirajara's profile, silhouetted against the reddened sky. It wasn't love she felt, not yet. But it was respect, trust, a partnership forged in adversity. And perhaps, she thought, that's what real families meant. People who choose to face together what they couldn't face alone. The Funai headquarters in Campo Grande was a grey 2-story building, with a worn appearance and a sign faded by the sun. Irasima felt her heart accelerate as they climbed the worn steps, the children between them holding hands. This was the moment of truth. 5 days had passed since leaving the farm. Only 2 days remained before the official search would begin. Inside the building, Apathetic employees typed on old computers. Curious looks followed the unusual group to the reception. The receptionist, a middle-aged woman with glasses at the tip of her nose, raised her eyes with disinterest. "Can I help you?" Ubirajara stepped forward, his posture erect, voice firm. "I need to speak with the regional coordinator. I'm Subirajara Guatapi 3, teacher from the Amongija village. These are my children." The mention of the name caused a murmur in the office. Someone had recognized the name, the village. News of the massacre had reached here, albeit in a distorted, minimized form. They were led to a waiting room, peeling walls decorated with photographs of smiling indigenous people, propaganda images that poorly reflected the reality of the reservations. The children sat on the wooden bench, restless, vigilant eyes. Jurema clutched Irasima's hand, as if afraid of being torn from her at any moment. They waited for 2 hours. Employees passed by, looked, whispered. Finally, a door opened. Professor Ubirajara called a man in a worn suit and loose tie. "I'm Paulo Mendes, interim coordinator. Please come with me." The man's gaze slid over Irasima and the children with barely disguised curiosity. "Just you, please." Ubirajara didn't move. "We are a family. Where I go, they go." The word family hung in the air, defiant. The coordinator hesitated, then shrugged. "As you wish." The coordinator's office was small, suffocating, dominated by stacks of files and a noisy fan that merely circulated the hot air. Paulo Mendes sat behind the desk, mechanical gestures of someone who repeats the same routine for decades. "So, Professor, we heard about the attack on the village. Regrettable. We're investigating, of course, within our limitations." The bureaucratic, distant tone made Irasima's blood boil. This wasn't regrettable, it was genocide. It was the continuation of a 5-century-old story. Ubirajara, however, maintained his calm. In a controlled voice, he narrated the events. His absence during the attack, the loss of his wife, the desperate search for his children, the meeting with Irasima. "This woman saved my children when no one else cared, when the state failed to protect them." The coordinator listened, taking occasional notes, his expression impenetrable. When Ubirajara finished, he adjusted his glasses and sighed. "I understand your gratitude, Professor, but there are protocols to follow." "The lady," he consulted his notes, "Irasima dos Santos has no legal authorization to take in indigenous children. This technically characterizes improper appropriation." "Appropriation?" Irasima couldn't contain herself. "I fed them when they were starving. I cured their fevers. I taught them what I could while respecting their culture. Is that a crime?" The coordinator was unfazed. "I'm not saying you acted badly. I'm saying you acted outside the law. And now that the father has been located, the standard procedure is to reintegrate them into the nearest indigenous community under Funai guardianship." That's when Raoni, always the quietest, stood up. At 9 years old, he seemed tiny in the room of adults, but his voice sounded clear, determined. "We're not going anywhere without Mother Irasima." The coordinator blinked, surprised. "Mother, what?" "Mother Irasima," repeated the boy, now in perfect Portuguese. "She saved us. She's ours too." Jana Wanna stood up beside her brother. "If you take her from us, we'll run away again." Jurema, the smallest, just squeezed Irasima's hand tighter, eyes fixed on the coordinator with an intensity that dispensed with words. Paulo Mendes leaned back in his chair, clearly uncomfortable. His job was simple when it came to papers, laws, categories, but he had before him something that escaped bureaucratic classifications, a family that didn't fit into any predefined box. "What exactly do you want?" he finally asked. Ubirajara and Irasima exchanged glances. It was the moment they had rehearsed during the trip. "We want legal recognition," said Ubirajara. "A shared custody arrangement. The children live with us, on the land where Irasima is established. I teach them about our culture, our language, our traditions. She provides the home, the safety, the daily care, and together we ensure they have both their Guato 3 heritage and their integration into Brazilian society." The coordinator laughed without humor. "That's irregular. There are no precedents." "Then we create one," replied Irasima, her voice firm. "These children deserve more than being statistics in your files. They deserve a real chance." The meeting lasted 3 more hours. Forms were filled out, declarations recorded, testimonies taped. The coordinator summoned social workers, legal consultants, even an anthropologist passing through the hallway. The case was too complex for quick decisions, they said. They would need time to analyze, consult Brasilia, check jurisprudence. How long? Asked Ubirajara when they were finally released. Already late in the afternoon. Weeks, maybe months, replied the coordinator, without looking them in the eyes. They left Funai exhausted, without definitive answers, only with an official letterhead paper that temporarily authorized the children's stay with Irasima and Ubirajara. Until the final decision of the administrative process, it was little, it was uncertain, but it was a beginning. That night, staying in a simple boarding house on the outskirts of Campo Grande, Irasima cried for the first time since the children had come into her life. Not from sadness, but from a complex emotion that mixed fear, hope, and a fierce determination to protect what she now considered her family. Ubirajara sat beside her on the narrow bed without touching. Just present. We will succeed, he said simply. The next morning, as they prepared to return to the farm, an official car parked in front of the boarding house. A well-dressed man with a leather briefcase got out, asking for them. Irasima's stomach sank. Was it some higher-level official coming to cancel the temporary authorization? But the man, who introduced himself as Dr. Ricardo Silveira, smiled upon seeing them. I'm a lawyer for the Association for the Defense of Indigenous Peoples. I heard about your case last night. I came to offer help. Inside the cramped boarding house room, the lawyer explained. A Funai employee, moved by the story, had contacted the association. The case had the potential to create jurisprudence, to open legal pathways that would benefit other non-conventional families, other indigenous children in vulnerable situations. It won't be easy, he warned. We'll have to face institutional prejudices, bureaucracy, perhaps even threats. But you're not alone now. The return journey was different. There was a plan. There were allies. There was hope. The children slept in the back of the pickup, exhausted but calm. Irasima looked out the window, observing the Cerrado landscape she now considered home. Beside her, Ubirajara drove in silence, focused on the road. What happens if we lose? She finally asked, giving voice to the fear she still carried. He didn't take his eyes off the road, but his voice was full of certainty. We won't lose. Some fights are too big to be lost. In the weeks that followed, the small farm was transformed. Ubirajara built another room in the house, expanding the space for the family that was growing not in number, but in roots. Sister Conciato visited regularly, bringing news, donations from the parish, and her reassuring presence. The lawyer called every week on Curumbiara's public telephone, updating them on the process. Mr. Teodoro, the suspicious neighbor, appeared one day with a calf as a gift, his silent way of apologizing for almost denouncing them. The news spread throughout the municipality. The Black Widow, the indigenous teacher, the children saved from the massacre. A family that defied definitions. There was resistance, of course. Malicious comments at the market, sideways glances in town, even a burning cross in front of the gate one night, reminiscent of an ancient hatred that still pulsed in the veins of deep Brazil. But for every act of rejection, there were 2 of acceptance. The rural schoolteacher, who offered to give the children private lessons. The retired doctor who came once a month to examine the little ones. The more distant neighbors who began to appear on Sundays, bringing cassava cakes, stories, and hands, willing to help with the crops. The process at Funai dragged on for 8 months. 8 months of testimonies, of exhausting trips to Campo Grande, of sleepless nights waiting for decisions from men in distant offices. Until on an April afternoon, when the white ipe trees were beginning to bloom, the lawyer appeared at the farm without warning. He brought with him not just papers, but a historic victory, the first officially recognized shared custody between an indigenous father and a non-indigenous woman with no blood relation to the children. You've created a precedent, he explained, as Irasima served coffee with cornmeal cake at the simple kitchen table. From now on, other families like yours will have a path to follow. That night they held a small celebration in the yard. Ubirajara played the flute, an instrument he himself had carved from the bamboo growing by the stream. The children danced around the bonfire, their illuminated faces reflecting the joy of finally achieved security. Irachema watched, seated on a log, her heart so full it seemed it might burst her chest. Ubirajara sat beside her, offering her a gourd of chimarrão. Their fingers touched briefly in the exchange, a contact that now happened more frequently, more naturally. It wasn't romantic love that existed between them, but something equally powerful: mutual respect, shared purpose, the quiet strength of those who have faced the worst and survived together. "We did it," she said, looking at the children who were now trying to teach Sister Consiwam through the steps of a Guato 3 dance. "We did it," he agreed. And then, in a lower voice, "Thank you for not giving up on them." Irachema shook her head. "Thank you for trusting me with your children." The look they exchanged contained everything that didn't need to be said, that sometimes families are created not by blood or by law, but by the courage to welcome, by the determination to protect, by the willingness to fight against a world that insists on separating what should be united. 10 years passed. The small farm transformed into an indigenous cultural center, where Guato 3 children from other villages came to learn both about their traditions and about the world beyond the reservation. Ubirajara had become a respected voice in the national indigenous movement. Irachema, now with grey hair, coordinated a handicraft cooperative that united indigenous and Afro-Brazilian techniques, creating unique pieces that were sold even abroad. The triplets, now teenagers, grew up between two worlds, that of ancestral tradition and that of Brazilian modernity. Raoni studied law in Campo Grande, determined to defend the rights of his people. Janana revealed herself as a talented artist, blending Guato 3 motifs with contemporary techniques. Jurema, always connected to the land, became a specialist in medicinal plants, documenting ancestral knowledge that risked being lost. On a September afternoon, exactly 10 years after the encounter that changed their lives, Ubirajara entered the workshop where Irachema was working at the loom. Without a word, he handed her a small object wrapped in a banana leaf. She opened it carefully. It was a miniature of their house carved in piki wood, each detail meticulously reproduced: the windows, the eaves, even the colored gourds that hung from the porch. And on the front door, engraved in small but precise letters, a phrase in Guato 3, followed by the translation, "Here we were remembered." Here she asked no questions, and because of that we stayed. Irachema raised her eyes, meeting Ubirajara's. They needed no words. Some stories are too big to fit into phrases. Some families are too strong to be defined by conventions. Some houses are too sacred to be just buildings. They are homes. They are refugees. They are living proof that, even on the margins, even in forgotten places, even in hearts the world tried to break, something new can be born, something resilient, something that can finally be called by the name it always deserved: love. If this narrative touched your heart, don't keep it to yourself. Subscribe to the channel, leave your like, and share in the comments which moment moved you the most. Just as Irachema and Ubirajara created a new path for non-conventional families, together we can make room for more stories that deserve to be told.